we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that made space exploration possible. We are your hosts, Quinn, he, him.
Chris, he, him.
And a patient, Chris, he, him.
And today we are back with part 5 of our ongoing series on the Mittelwerk Death Camp and Rocket Factory, the birthplace of the V2, the world's first ballistic missile, and the forebear of just about every launch vehicle or missile currently around. Now, part 4 shifted the focus away from Mittelwerk proper a bit, and we took a look at what was going on in the wider Nazi rocket program and its leadership, as well as just the trends of World War II through 1944. So, September 8th, 1944 marked the first combat use of the V2 when it was fired on Paris, shortly after the city was liberated. After that, thousands more V2 ballistic missiles and V1 flying bombs were fired on London, Antwerp, and dozens of other Allied cities. While the V1 buzz bombs could be intercepted or shot down, the V2 had no countermeasures, and because it approached its supersonic speeds, gave no warning it was about to strike. The only thing that eventually freed London and later other cities was Allied troops pushing the front line so far back that the missiles physically could not reach their targets. That was the only countermeasure to the V2. This episode, part 5, is going to go back to the Dora concentration camps and the Mittelwerk tunnels under the Konstein Hill. As always, we have a huge content warning on this episode and this series. At the end of the day, we are talking about genocide, slavery, and mass executions, all of which played a very large and formative role in space history, rocketry, and space exploration, which is why we are covering it in as much detail as we are. Anyone who has made it this far into the series probably knows what to expect, but if you do not want to hear about this stuff, do not listen.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, yeah. How are you guys doing? Very loaded question, I know.
You let me
that.
You let us start a little later so that I could sleep, and I did.
Hooray.
Which means that I woke up
energized, ready to go.
30 minutes prior to the scheduled start time, laid in bed until 15 minutes before the scheduled start time, continued laying in bed until 10 minutes before the start time, went to the bathroom.
He is still in bed, listener.
To do my morning ritual, and then went downstairs to get food and a drink because I needed to take my medication, which means I arrived technically past the scheduled start time, and then was pleased to learn that literally everyone else arrived past the scheduled start time.
Of course.
Yeah, I was busy cleaning my lungs.
How am I doing? I'm aching. My back aches. I slept bad on it. Or it's because I was wearing a shirt. It's what happens like when you have when you're laying in a position and like cloth bunches up and it just stays there for several hours. Yeah, I think that's what happened because I went to bed wearing my shirt for the first time in forever, and that's probably what happened.
Fucking hate that.
I sometimes enjoy whenever I fall asleep and there's a bit of it cloth kind of bundled up on the pillow, because then I wake up with fun crisscross etches on my face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are fun. And I get to very briefly, pretend that I had a seedy past as you've got fencing scars and whatnot. Among other dreams. That was just one example of them. But yeah, I will just get us into the next section.
Yeah, let's just...
Cycles of death.
Oh, we're jumping in. Okay.
Yeah, because we're going back to Mittelwerk in 1944, and it's, yeah. At the same time, in talking about this, I did learn a lot in researching this episode. A lot of stuff that even through this series, prior to this series, misconceptions that I had about Mittelwerk, Dora, and how the deaths happened, which we are going to be talking about and clarifying in this one. Now, where we left off with Mittelwerk in early 1944, construction on the tunnels was finished and the factory was being ramped up to full-scale production of V2 ballistic missiles. Only after the first missiles were assembled were Mittelwerk slave laborers allowed to start working on their own shelter, the Dora concentration camp, which was, at the time, technically a subcamp of Buchenwald. Concentration camps worked where you would have a main camp, and then subcamps would be both reliant on the main camp and administratively below it. Prisoners in the camp complex were split up in several ways, by nationality, by armband color, and by their assigned roles in the factory. So-called specialists, mostly French resistance electricians and Soviet Red Army mechanics and the like, were handpicked from Buchenwald for their technical skills and entrusted with actually assembling the missiles. Unskilled laborers, members of the so-called transport commandos, had it much worse. They had been the ones to dig the tunnels under the huge Konstein Hill, expanding the old mine shafts into the Mittelwerk factory. And once that was done, they pushed the missiles and material around on rail carts by hand, ferrying them from workshop to workshop. So if you remember, what we talked about in the prior parts is that Mittelwerk looks like a ladder. It kind of weaves and waves, but it is two parallel mine shafts, and between them are tunnels like rungs on a ladder, and each of those is a different workshop. Each of them, a V2 missile will travel down the ladder, picking up parts as it goes, until finally being tested, fully assembled and tested in the massive Hull 41, which we also talked about as the location of most of Mittelwerk's executions. Death came much easier to the men of the transport commandos. They worked much harder shifts, and they were much more replaceable and thus easier to execute than the specialists. While the specialists by no means had it easy, this is something that I have tried to reiterate whenever talking about how this camp was better than that camp, how certain things made life easier.
It's still a concentration and death camp at the end of the day.
Exactly. Everyone here is in a horrible situation, and deaths still happened at every single step, every group, every commando. But the vast majority of prisoner deaths at Mittelwerk came from the transport commandos, the guys who were doing the mining, the guys who were doing the brute labor. And also commando here, I might be mispronouncing that, it might just be commando, it's spelled with a K. It just means like group here. All of the prisoners were organized into work groups or commandos.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'd have
I think that needs clarification, especially considering the fact that we have a vast need.
And even the transport commandos, that was like multiple different groups. You would have your group of 50 would have a designation, and this is, your transport commando 5 or something like that.
No, all I'm saying is explaining that commando in this case means something other than
yeah.
Most people would assume a commando is.
Exactly. But from looking at the official death numbers that the SS logged and the number of sick and wounded prisoners shipped back to Buchenwald, it's clear that death at Mittelwerk came in cycles. After the first brutal months of digging the tunnels, the death rate dropped rapidly. It never went away, but working on the factory lines, even pushing the mine carts for 12 hours a day, was far safer than the previous mining work. I bring this up because digging and mining only stopped at Mittelwerk for a few months. The SS had thousands of unskilled, non-specialist prisoners on site that they did not trust to build the rockets, and so they found ways to keep them busy. As soon as the tunnels of Mittelwerk were finished, those workers were redirected to building the Dora concentration camp, and as soon as that was done, they were handed over to Hans Kammler's new project, carving out the entire Konstein Hill. If you remember from Part 4, Mittelwerk was slowly expanding to include Luftwaffe projects, a German Air Force. First the V-1 cruise missile, then engines for German bombers. When that was done, Kammler went to Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and told him that he could turn Mittelwerk, he could turn the entire Nordhausen region into the new hub of German aircraft manufacturing, all hidden deep underground from Allied bombing, because all of these factories are getting flattened by bombing, by US bombing during the day and British bombing at night. Kammler's plan is to basically take what he started with Mittelwerk and move the entirety of Nazi Germany's aviation manufacturing underground and under Mittelwerk. Under this plan, Mittelwerk and Dora wouldn't just be the factory for Hitler's new weapons. They'd be where every single superweapon, every rocket jet prototype and balsa wood fighter jet would be built. Of course, this called for a massive expansion of slave labor in the Nordhausen region, turning the factory into the center of an entire constellation of subcamps and work sites. All of this was quickly approved and organized mostly under the auspices of a new command, Sonderstab Kammler, or Special Task Force Kammler. I hate this guy. Like, we talked about it last time, he is, like, this is how you get ahead in the SS. You organize, you, like, gather up as much power under yourself. Kammler is not only in charge of Mittelwerk, he's in charge of the units that are launching the V2s, he's in charge of the factories that are building the V2s, and he has now convinced Goering, literally in the waning months of the war, that he can, like, turn this one mountain into Lockheed, Boeing, every single factory that builds planes is going to be under this one hill.
Christ. Okay.
Yeah. He's going to have to dig out this entire hill, and like we talked about, the digging, the mining at Mittelwerk was when the death rate was at its highest. Now, like we said, Mittelwerk is cut into a huge hill in the Nordhausen region, which is also right next to the town of Nordhausen, and this hill is called the Konstein. It's still around, you can visit it, you can see parts of Mittelwerk that are still open for tourism and education. The hill was already shot through with mine shafts. Mittelwerk itself was originally made by expanding those tunnels, and Kammler's idea was to turn the Konstein into an anthill, carving it out so much that it could fit all of the factories for every aircraft that you could paint a swastika on. These would mostly be separate facilities from Mittelwerk, with their own tunnels, hangars, and supply lines. The upshot of all this was that as soon as the Dora camp was completed and V2s are rolling out of the Mittelwerk toward either Peenemünde or Blizna for testing, an entire constellation of subcamps and work sites popped up around Nordhausen. By April 1945, there were 39 subcamps around Dora and dozens more work sites. We're a little early to it in the timeline, but this is another part of the terminology that sometimes gets mixed up. Taken all together, these concentration camps, factories, and work sites became known as Mittelbau, of which Dora and Mittelwerk are parts. So in researching this, you will sometimes find Mittelwerk Dora or Mittelbau Dora or, Nordhausen Dora or Dora Mittelbau. Like, there's all kinds of different permutations of this. But the way it works is that once these subcamps become a thing, Mittelbau becomes the umbrella organization. It becomes the official camp, quote unquote. And then beneath that, you have the camp, the concentration camp of Dora, which is an official camp. It gains recognition and administrative power. And then below that, you have a constellation of subcamps that are all subordinate to Dora. And in this situation, Mittelwerk becomes what is called a work site, and all of these other camps feed out to other work sites. This is an important distinction. Camps were simply where prisoners lived. They'd be organized into work groups or commandos and commute to sites every day by train, truck, or later on foot. Work sites are mostly self-explanatory. They're related to certain projects and could even be mobile. Camps were not assigned to work sites or vice versa. One camp could feed workers to several sites, and work sites could have prisoners at them from dozens of camps. Sometimes, like Mittelwerk and Dora, a camp and a site would be close together, but it was not uncommon for prisoners to have to walk up to 10 kilometers or 6 miles every morning to their work site. All of this, these camps and work sites, fed into projects that Kammler believed would turn the Konstein into the sole source manufacturing hub for Goering's Luftwaffe. Underground projects were given mineral code names. Zement, or cement, was a modified quarry for producing liquid oxygen rocket fuel. Malachite would be a fighter factory, while larger projects were given animal code names like deer, boar, tortoise, and calf. Working on expanding the Mittelwerk network started in the spring of 1944 and proceeded extremely quickly and with massive human casualties, Kammler's specialty. A lot of subcamps were made simply by taking over local buildings. The Vida camp, for example, was just a farm. Some concentration camps were set up just outside or even in local towns. This is something that I feel like isn't talked enough about, like the concentration camp network and the subcamps, is that they could be incredibly tiny. You know, like the old Abernathy place down the road, that's suddenly a death camp now.
That's
like there are concentration camps in this network that is just like a garage. You know, you just have like a house on either side, and in the middle is a work camp that is like, it used to be home to a family of 5, and now it is home to like 50 people who are starving to death.
Yeah, that preschool you brought your kids to now houses like 100 people.
Yeah, and, you know, 3 of them die every day. It's...
Well, you weren't lying at the start of this one.
By October, when the Mittelbau complex was formally named its own concentration camp, so it gets out from under... Mittelbau stops being a subordinate subcamp of Buchenwald. It becomes its own official thing in October 1944. By the time that happens, more than half of all prisoners lived in subcamps, like Vida, Harzungen, and Rotelberode. So Dora remains the biggest camp, but Mittelbau, it is primarily subcamp by capacity. The oldest of the subcamps, one I mentioned back in part 3, was also a unique case. Laura was formed around the same time as Dora, and when the other subcamps were rolled into the Mittelbau umbrella, Laura actually remained attached to Buchenwald. It was kind of a special case. Like with Vida, it was a modified farm the SS had taken over. The main worksite for Laura was Lehesten, which they carved out of the Konstein Hill and which survivor M.A. Boniface described like this, quote, "The underground factory was finished after a work project on a gigantic scale. It was used for fine-tuning and as a test stand for the V2's propulsive device. The compressor rooms were used to produce liquid oxygen. The device's ignition took place in the 2 blockhouse-shaped test stands overlooking the quarry's enormous theater. Every day, 25 or 30 tests were carried out. So Laura both provided slave labor to like carve out this quarry, as well as work within the V2 test site. As far as living conditions, and I really want to hammer again on the fact that every one of these places are concentration camps, Laura was described by survivors as a mixed bag. The guards were SS, who were generally known for being crueler, and the camp capos were all German Greens, who were criminals instead of the socialist Reds who ran Buchenwald. We talked about this in previous episodes. Camp administration, large parts of different camps, like administration, how they're run, who looks after the prisoners, is handed over to other prisoners. And depending on who your capos are and basically what they're in for, camp conditions at different concentration camps can go up or down markedly. But on the plus side, prisoners said that the roll calls were quick, they got a weekly hot shower, and they even had a small canteen and movie theater that they could use. So, I don't know. It's like they say, it's a mixed bag. They have the SS, and they have capos who are on the crueler side, but they also get like slightly more amenities than some other camps.
It's still a nightmare, but do you have the faintest hint of I can shower?
Yes, and this does also introduce a dynamic in these camps of like there are ones that are infamous and that we are going to talk about that are infamous even within this system. Like later on, we'll get to SS guys who berate their prisoners and say stuff like, "Oh, you think you're still in Buchenwald? You think you've got it all nice and posh?" There are like prisoners are threatened with like, "Oh, you think like you have it so nice in Laura? Like, how about I send you to Elric? How about I send you to Dora?" This is used as both a threat and, you know, like a prisoner who becomes an informer could be rewarded by being sent to a nicer camp. This all factors in. The SS are aware of the different conditions and the pros and cons of these camps, and they leverage it against the prisoners. The Vida camp was set up in a barn literally inside the town of Vida. To the Russian, Polish, and French prisoners sent there, it seemed to be a welcome change. The guards were Luftwaffe, Air Force, who were notably less cruel than the SS, the capos were communist Reds, and the local villagers got along well with the prisoners, often coming out to watch the Russians dance as a man named Ivan played a harmonica. The guards and prisoners even played a few friendly soccer matches on the Vida town field, and most of the work for the prisoners was chopping down trees and helping local farmers with their harvests. Definitely hard work, but not mining out the Constein. Unfortunately, it was not to last. As survivor Jacques Christian Bailey wrote, quote, "Through the door, I saw a helmeted SS, arms in hand, going into the courtyard. The SS commander came out of his office, pale, bareheaded, his face worn and his uniform undone. An SS man, a defiant smile on his lips, was pushing him with violent shoves in the back, a revolver pointed between his shoulders. They left the camp and got into a black Volkswagen that sped off with a squeal of its tires. When they arrived, the SS from Buchenwald had found the camp open, German prisoners unsupervised in the village, and the commander asleep in his office." So basically, like, an inspection happens. They find that, like, the more doctrinaire, the SS from Buchenwald, decide they don't like how things are doing, how this guy is running things, and they get rid of him.
Gotcha.
The day after the commander was removed, Vida was emptied and all of its prisoners were spread out to other camps, mostly Dora. Though a few weeks later, Vida was repopulated with new prisoners and an all-SS administration. And from that point on, it goes from being one of the nicer camps to be at to one of the worse.
Yeah.
Now, spreading prisoners between all of these camps was not just to have them work on expanding the facilities under the Constein. Through the second half of 1944, the SS was preoccupied with the idea of organized communist resistance in Dora, and this was happening across the wider concentration camp network. They saw camps like Buchenwald, where Reds had, like, there were actually, like, Sonderkommando revolutions, like attempted breakouts or takeovers of camps, like mostly organized under the auspices of, like, Soviet POWs or German socialists. And the SS basically decided, like, oh, we can't let the Reds run any camp. Splitting prisoners up was seen as a way to disrupt any organizing they might be doing. While the prisoners had started off under the administration of green capos, that is, criminals and almost always Germans, control had gradually shifted to a coalition of German and Soviet Reds, or socialists, many of whom were veteran administrators from Buchenwald. Another thing you have to remember is that, like, the vast majority of the people in Mittelbau are new to the concentration camp network. They have been captured in France, Italy, they are Yugoslavian, they are Hungarians who were just annexed by Germany like a couple months prior. So having capos, having administration from Buchenwald who had survived several years was a huge help toward somewhat raising the standard of living at these camps. And while some members of the SS preferred to negotiate with capos and the so-called camp elders, or Legeraltesten, to keep their prisoners, like, just compliant enough to be useful slaves, which is how Buchenwald mostly operated, others were diehards and considered any prisoner organization or delegation of powers to be an insult. As an example, survivor Aimé Boniface remembered one speech given at Christmas 1944 by an SS officer. Quote, "You are our enemies, but we will force you to work with us to destroy your homelands and to destroy even yourselves. We have only one leader, Adolf Hitler, who came providentially to save Europe."
Thank you for the quote, Quinn.
Yeah.
Christ.
And this is Christmas, you know? Like, Christmas 1944, this guy comes out, and, like, I don't know, we'll talk about it later, but, like, literally your best case scenario as a prisoner is that your SS commandant doesn't view you as a person but a resource, or that he is at least, like, it's if they care about efficiency more than cruelty, because some SS commandants are still, like, fucking monsters who deserve the highest pillars in hell, but they are like, well, these prisoners are resources and we should at least use them efficiently, so I'm going to feed them so that they last longer. And that is the best case. And the worst case is the guys who consider their prisoners subhuman and should be, like, abused and humiliated and executed at a whim. And these same paranoid delusions were playing out at other camps too. Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. They all saw widespread SS purges of Red prisoners for, quote, communist activities. At Dora, these were carried out by a man by the name of Helmut Bischoff. He didn't actually have the rank or approval to do any of this and went behind the backs of his SS superiors, which is how you get ahead in the SS. He's not given this job. He is just a paranoid fuck who decides that he and like a gang of other SS officers are just going to root out the Red Conspiracy. Based on Bischoff's fears, groups of prisoners were rounded up and sent off to a nearby prison, a real one, for torture or execution. On November 11th, he picked a group of only Frenchmen and only those who were in the hospital. Basically, he went into the camp's hospital and said, like, any Frenchman who is too sick to work is coming with me. In mid-December, a stranger scene played out. All of the Soviet prisoners of Dora were lined up at a roll call, and one of their leaders, Nicholas Petrenko, was called on to identify all of the saboteurs in their ranks. He did. More than 100 were arrested and executed. What makes this unique is that Petrenko was actually in charge of an organized sabotage cell made up of Soviet prisoners, and he had been tortured into giving up the names of some of his co-conspirators. But according to survivor Jean-Michel, he deliberately picked other people at that roll call, protecting the organization at the cost of dooming 100 innocent men to death. For what it's worth, he died with them. And like, I don't know if that's brave. I think it's brave. And like, he protected, there was active resistance, there was sabotage, but at the same time, the SS considered everything to be sabotage. Like, if you fucked up if you were a specialist and you fucked up working on the rocket because you're, given a single piece of bread a day and you're dying, that was the same thing as being part of Petrenko's sabotage squad. I don't have the quote, but Jean-Michel and the author of the main book that I am sourcing for this, the Dora Camp, who was a survivor and a historian, they talk about the impossible situation of the innocent men who were picked to die. Because, what do you do? If you say that you're innocent, that's exactly what a guilty man would do. So yeah, like, Petrenko's network continued operating, continued sabotaging V2s and thus saving civilian lives. But to keep them going, to keep them protected, innocent prisoners had to die.
Yeah.
By the end of 1944, almost the entire Red Camp administration of Dora had been liquidated or committed suicide to avoid torture.
It's just getting worse.
Since I figured now would be a good time for a quick bright spot, not all of the prominent Reds were killed. Some escaped. Most survivor accounts, including the author of the main book I'm citing here, agree that in February 1945, a group of 10 Soviet prisoners were put in charge of camouflaging planes at an airstrip near Peenemünde. Despite the site having been bombed over a year before in Operation Hydra, the Usedom concentration camp was still running. There was still some rocket development work happening at Peenemünde, and they had a small concentration camp to feed in that labor. Anyway, the Soviets hatched a plan to escape. So they'd been put in charge of camouflaging these planes at an airstrip. They murdered their SS guard with a crowbar, took his uniform, and went to greet a German bomber that had just landed. When the crew hopped out, the Soviets killed one of them and kidnapped the other. One of them, Mikhail Devyatiev, happened to be a pilot himself. I believe he was also an ace pilot. And he flew the entire group back to Warsaw, dodging Soviet fighters along the way because they're flying a Nazi bomber.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
Yeah. Devyatiev earned the Hero of the Soviet Union for his bravery.
Deserved.
But he earned it in 1957. See, as soon as he landed, he was captured by the NKVD.
Oh, so did he spend the next decade in prison?
He didn't spend it in prison. He spent a few months in prison. But he was basically, like, this is the thing with the NKVD, with the Soviet army. Any POWs, like, there are so many stories of Soviet POWs escaping from concentration camps because that's, like, Soviet POWs were not extended prisoner rights. And then they make it back to Soviet lines and they are immediately treated as German spies. So even after several months, he and a couple other of these prisoners are imprisoned by the NKVD and tortured and interrogated. And whenever he gets out, he spends the next 12 years basically trying to find a job because he has been blacklisted. He is untrustworthy within the Soviet system. He winds up working like on a fishing boat, and then he's captaining a small ferry. He was only cleared of suspicion when Sergei Korolev personally intervened on his behalf in 1957, since he had given Korolev valuable info on the German rocket program. He had firsthand knowledge of what was happening at Peenemünde, and he gave that to Korolev in Chertok. And 12 years later, once Korolev is the hottest guy in the Soviet Union, once he has put Sputnik in orbit, he uses some of that cachet to, like, reward Devyatiev. We will be talking about this story more in the future.
Yeah, at least he got his bright spot at the end of it, even though it took forever.
Yeah.
And also shout out to my favorite action, killing Nazis with crowbars.
Hell yeah, yeah. Like, wondering, like, the pilots are hopping out of the bomber, they see an SS guy guarding some prisoners, and they're wondering, like, why is that guy covered in blood?
Why is he doing, like, the Half-Life default? He's doing the Half-Life default stance with a crowbar.
They're Weekend at Bernieing the dead SS guy. They're just, like puppeting him along, like, oh, yeah.
That's my face.
There is the crowbar is like embedded in his skull and poking out like a 45-degree angle.
Yeah, that's how they carry the crowbar. You've been promoted to crowbar sheath.
Now, talking about all of these subcamps and how conditions were different between them, I feel it is important to highlight the worst of them. The camp with by far the worst guards, commandants, capos, and work sites.
The Hell of Elrich.
For clarity, there were technically 2 Elric subcamps. Or Elric had its own mini subcamp set up in a nearby restaurant. And again, coming back to this, is that a concentration camp can be as small as a room. The Elric Burgergarten camp was set up in the Burgergarten restaurant in the town of Elric, while the much larger Elric Juliuschutte camp was set up in the abandoned Juliuschutte factory. So again, this is them taking over abandoned local infrastructure, sometimes not abandoned, they'll just take someone's home and kick them out, and turning them into subcamps in the Mittelbau network to feed to these various work sites. Prisoners knew them as the Little Camp and Big Camp, respectively. For this section, when I say Elric, I will generally be talking about the much larger Juliuschutte camp. It was the biggest subcamp in the Mittelbau network. By October 1944, it held more than 8,000 prisoners, mostly Soviets, French, and Polish, but with a large contingent of Roma and Hungarian Jews who were sent to Mittelwerk in May. Because of its size and how it was run, Elric had by far the largest share of prisoner deaths. By November 1944, even before Elric was fully operational, the SS reported 570 deaths across the entire network of subcamps and worksites for that month. Of them, more than 500 were from Elric alone.
Christ.
So this is a place making up like this one camp. And obviously it's cyclical. Different work sites become like more dangerous or less lethal as work goes. But in November 1944, this one camp made up more than 5/6 of all prisoner deaths at Mittelbau. Elric was apart from the other camps in how zealous its administration was. This was not Vita. They had the worst capos. They had pure SS across the camp. A French survivor, Serge Miller, recalls his first introduction to the camp like this, quote, "We saw an SS officer, or rather a puppet, a lanky-looking fellow moving towards us. He crossed his arms on his chest, threw his head back, and jeered at us. 'So, that's how you remove your forage caps, is it? You must think you're still at Buchenwald, in the sanatorium with the Bolsheviks. Well, that's all over now. I'm in charge here, and to start with, you bunch of louts are going to do a half hour of exercise.' On paper, that may not have had the same effect, but I swear it had one on us. He didn't speak, he bellowed, gesticulated, and frothed at the mouth as if he'd been bitten by a rabid dog."
Jesus Christ.
That was SS Lagerführer, or camp leader, Walter Fitz. And again, for me, it's coming back to that thing we talked about where like the SS is aware this guy is screaming at these prisoners and saying like, oh, you think you're still at like the spa that is Buchenwald? Well, the Bolsheviks aren't in charge here. The criminals are. And, you know, obviously bad capos, good capos in every single group. At Elric specifically, I don't have it much in the script, but prisoners recall one blockhouse with one good criminal capo named Theo, who went out of his way to protect the prisoners under his jurisdiction as much as he could. But at the same time, in terms of like what group you want running your camp, you want the Reds. You don't want the prisoners, especially the criminals. Especially because the criminals are generally Germans, which means they can speak German, which means they are much more in tight with the SS. They are generally, like the green capos tend to be much more collaborators with the SS. They're on the guards side instead of the prisoners side. Again, that's a generalization. It's all trends and, you know, there are good ones and bad ones, but like, fuck.
Yeah.
So The Elric capos were all Greens, and they were actually the same Greens who had first been exiled from Buchenwald and then from Dora. So I said before that Dora starts out with green capos and the Reds later kind of like take charge. It's kind of like a silent coup within prison politics, like prisoner politics. Elric is where those guys are sent after.
Gotcha.
While the Reds at the other camps argued, resisted, or negotiated with the SS for better conditions, survivors describe the Greens at Elric as the SS's zealous assistants, and zealous assistants is a quote from one of the survivors. Everything in Elric was set up with cruelty in mind. The prisoners were not just resources to be expended for the Reich, they were subhumans to be humiliated, tortured, and degraded. Their work sites were exclusively brutal, digging tunnels, building rail lines, and shoveling coal. They were not specialists like in Dora, and as the largest subcamp, Elric was able to replace its workers quickly and at huge scale. This is something that some prisoners bring up in their recountings of Mittelbau. They knew it was all pointless. This was late 1944. The Allied armies are actively into Germany proper. The US has taken the German city of Aachen. The Soviets are pushing in from the east, like the Reich itself, the administrative Reich, not just the occupied European countries, is losing territory. There was absolutely no hope that any of these extra Mittelbau projects, any of these fighter or like engine factories would be built before the Allies reached them, let alone make a difference in the war. And even the SS knew it. They were being starved and tortured to dig really big, empty holes. That's it.
The suffering is the point.
Exactly. Serge Miller was assigned to shovel coal and wrote, quote, "That was really the most useless and the most painful way to die. And each shovelful of coal and with every plank on my shoulder, I saw death looming. After 8 days unloading the carts, I was nothing but skin and bones."
Don't you see it's necessary? This is necessary to make Germany great again.
Of course. And like, I don't know, like there isn't record, like Kammler, there's no quote of Kammler saying, "I know that this isn't going to happen, but do it anyway because it'll kill them and I hate them." But like, end of World War II, Germany had no shortage of people who were completely deluded into thinking that, the Soviets would be pushed back from Berlin, all those fictional military units on the map. But
yeah,
there were just as many, if not more, who knew how things were going. Like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, famously spent the entire last 2 years of the war trying to find ways of both taking power and making sure that he would survive the fall of Nazi Germany. Another aspect of Elric life was the neglect. When the SS guards were not being deliberately cruel to the prisoners, they were being cruel, again, through neglect. In a purely clinical sense, the camp was horribly run. The SS forgot, or just chose not to, order new clothes for the prisoners, so the inmates wore the same ragged uniforms for months. When the camp ordered a louse disinfecting shower, the hot water destroyed those uniforms and left thousands of men naked. The SS sent them off to the work sites anyway, in a particularly harsh winter. It would be 3 months before they bothered to order more clothes, by which time most of the nudists, as the SS called them, had died. And I hate that we're talking about the best case scenario, where the best case scenario is that the SS views them as resources to be expended efficiently, but other camps will provide uniforms, other camps will provide food, because they want their prisoners to last. Elric just doesn't do that. The camp commandant also frequently forgot to order food for the prisoners. When a nearby bread factory was bombed,
forgot.
Yeah, he didn't find a new source for food. All of the other subcamps, when this bread factory goes away, they set up contracts with another bread factory because they want to keep their prisoners on starvation diet to make them last longer. Elric just didn't. And so the camp went into a full-blown famine, with inmates only given soup that was little more than water. 4 days into the famine, prisoners staged a break-in of the camp kitchen. SS guards shot 2 of them and wounded several more. At the work sites, Elric prisoners begged those from other camps for scraps of food and picked out of the trash of the civilian workers' canteen. A week into the famine, the first case of cannibalism was found. A Roma prisoner was caught carving pieces out of a frozen corpse. Serge Miller describes the scene as this, quote, "The camp commander, informed by the capo of the Revier about this first case of cannibalism, brought his wife and the entire staff out to watch the scene. I was informed in time to get there myself, and the man did not hesitate, following a sign from the commander who had brought a piece of bread and salt with him, to continue again in public what he had begun in secret. The sight of the bread whet his appetite, and after having carved another slice from the corpse and salted it well, made himself a sandwich which he devoured in several minutes. I was well placed to see the color of the human flesh, which was dark red, as well as the commander who smiled at his wife as if to say, "My dear, I am offering you a rare spectacle." Late that night, the man was executed by prisoners of all different nationalities. So they encouraged, like the guards and commandant of Elric encouraged cannibalism. They thought it was funny.
And took delight in it.
Finally, there was the children. As we talked about in Part 4, Nazi Germany invaded and conquered its ally Hungary in early 1944 because the Hungarians were looking a little shaky on the battlefield and were trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. This brought an influx of Hungarian Jewish prisoners into the concentration camp system, and specifically to Mittelbau. Because they weren't trusted to work on the rocket lines, they were generally sent to the transport or mining commandos, and thus to Elric. I know this is a lot of long quotes, but I wanted to include this one especially. Mittelbau survivor Jean-Pierre Couture wrote, "Every night, some 20 children grouped together in a corner of the large room. The adult prisoners refrained from taking over this place, though the block was overcrowded to such an extent that at night only a pathway through the center aisle remained free to enable people to get to the toilet. Everywhere else, jammed up against one another on the bricks, on the ground, prisoners of every nationality pressed together. There were even people under the bunk beds, which were themselves overcrowded. In the space that remained free, there were several blankets and sawdust. That was where the little Hungarian Jews, from about 11 to 15 years old, slept. Slept is a figure of speech. Throughout the blackout, the voices of these children could be heard whimpering, and so it seemed, calling out for their parents who would never come. Moreover, as it was supposed they had smaller appetites because they were only children, these poor kids sometimes only got reduced rations, even though they were integrated into the adult work commandos. The whimpers of those children are my most distressing memory, and are the origin, or rather the confirmation, of my tenacious hatred of their tormentors." Children were still expected to work and formed into their own commandos. I do not have specific numbers, but very few survived. Many prisoners reported seeing them go off to a work site, and for none of them to return. Elric was shut down in April 1945, just a few weeks before the Allies reached and liberated Nordhausen. Unfortunately, the new east-west German border passed directly through the camp, and so it would not be memorialized by either side until the reunification in the 90s.
I don't have words.
No, there aren't any.
Remember when people say that it's good to punch Nazis, just remember this.
Final phase.
By early 1945, the SS could clearly see the writing on the wall. Allied offensives were pushing into Germany proper from the east, west, and south. Kammler was increasingly wrapped up in commanding the V-2 launch crews instead of the factory that built them. As prisoners were evacuated from camps like Auschwitz, they flooded into Mittelbau. Between the frost and the overcrowding, work effectively broke down in March 1945. Smaller camps started to be dissolved, their prisoners either spread around Mittelbau or sent off in convoys to camps like Sachsenhausen. More than 1,000 men were sent from Elric to Bergen-Belsen, more than 200 kilometers away. Most died on the trip. This entire process was basically chaos. Prisoners from every camp around Germany and occupied Europe being shuffled to every other camp, no one knowing where the front lines were or if the camps they were sending those convoys to had already been captured by the Allies. Except those convoys were filled with dying men, either crammed into cattle cars or forced to walk in front of SS guards. One development of this period was the Ballistic camp. Previously, it was a subcamp like the others, housing prisoners and sending them off to the work sites. But in early 1945, as prisoners flooded in from camps all over Germany or were sent off in their own convoys, the number of sick and injured and dying prisoners spiked. Normally, they'd have been sent off to Buchenwald to die, but that was no longer an option. Instead, the SS changed the Kaserne from a subcamp to a sick camp. Prisoners at any other Mittelbau site who fell ill, got hurt, or just couldn't work anymore were shipped to Bolke Kaserne. From Nordhausen under National Socialism, quote, "2 empty garage halls served as accommodation for the inmates. There were no beds nor washing facilities. The inmates lay on the concrete floor and were largely left to their own fate. From January to the beginning of April 1945, over 3,000 people died in the subcamp. On April 3rd and 4th, 1945, the Royal Air Force launched back-to-back bombing raids against Nordhausen and surrounding towns. They destroyed most of Nordhausen, killing around 8,000 residents, and hit the Bolke Kaserne camp. 1,500 inmates were killed. On the 6th, Canadian troops cut off the rail line supplying new V-2s to the German launch batteries. On the 10th, American troops of the U.S. First Army captured Nordhausen, finding Mittelwerk in the camps deserted except for hundreds of dying prisoners left behind, mostly in the ruined Bolke Kaserne. And that is the end of Mittelwerk. Mittelbau, Dora, Elric, Vida, Harzungen, this network of camps, subcamps, factories, and work sites.
Yeah, we're in line with this one.
No. And this is something where I do want to clarify a misconception that I had. None of this takes away from any of the horror that we've talked about or the deaths and cruelty that went into the V2. But whenever this is framed, it is often framed as the V2 killing, the act of making the V2 killing upwards of 20,000 people. And it did kill thousands. Thousands died mining the tunnels for Mittelwerk or working as specialists in the factory. But the vast majority, and I think this might even be worse, the vast majority of the deaths happened after the V2s were being produced, when Kammler and Goering and the Luftwaffe decided, let's just turn this mountain into an anthill. Let's just spend thousands of lives just digging for something that we know will never happen. Like,
the suffering and the death is the point, like I said.
Yeah, it
doesn't matter the fact that you are having your nation and its shit pushed in. No,
yeah,
just continue. Don't worry.
And the worst part is, so few of these people, like the SS, actually intended to go down with this ship. Heinrich Himmler was looking for a way out like 2 years prior. Hans Kammler goes missing at the end of the war. There is speculation, like he gets interviewed by the US, but there is still heavy speculation about whether he gets paperclipped or not. At the end of the day, we don't know. Like, regardless of the options, he very probably never faced justice for what he did. So I do have one last quote from the book The Dora Camp that kind of covers, it puts this into words better than I could have. Those who ran the Harzungen, Elric, and Waffelben camps between May 1944 and April 1945 were merely following orders. Those who belonged to the Luftwaffe, such as the commander of Harzungen or the doctors at Harzungen and Elric, behaved fairly well, given the circumstances of the time. The SS, on the other hand, were all in all a somber bunch of brutes, and they bear a heavy responsibility in the prisoners' sufferings. But it should not be forgotten that the essential responsibility was Kammler's, for it was he who ran both the work sites and the camps. It is extraordinary that such a project, as insane as the digging of 4 million square feet of galleries, was carried out with such obstinacy, even in the final weeks, and that nothing was done in this regard to protect the existence of an increasingly scarce labor force. Right to the very end, there were still leaders and business executives who were willing accomplices in a massacre that, in the apocalypse of the end of Nazism, appeared premeditated. Like, no one within the SS leadership spoke up to how insane this was. Like, even in purely clinical tones of, like, the SS viewing these prisoners as a labor force to be expended for the good of Germany. Like, even in those, like, psychotic terms, it was still a waste what Kammler was doing. All, like, building some Maginot bunker bullshit to try and turn the Konstein into an underground hyper factory while the rest of Germany burned. There have been a lot of estimates over time and attempts to figure out how many people died in what area and in which circumstances. This is difficult because of how the camps were run. For example, remember that before Mittelbau became its own camp system, it was subordinate to Buchenwald. The only deaths counted at Dora were prisoners who actually died there. Sick or wounded inmates were normally shipped off to Buchenwald to die. For this episode and this series' estimate, I am again going to be relying on the work of historian and Dora survivor André Sellier. His book, A History of the Dora Camp, goes into great detail attempting to derive the death count from different things the SS recorded. Overall camp population per month, the number of prisoners in convoys being sent in or out, and the actual recorded deaths at the camps that month. As we said earlier, the death rate at Mittelbau changed over time and based on the work that was being done. Using numbers sourced by survivors and historians, we can estimate that almost 6,000 prisoners died from late 1943 to early 1944, digging out the Mittelwerk tunnels and building the factory itself. This represents more than a third of the total prisoners working at Mittelwerk. However, once the factory was running and prisoners could live in the Dora camp instead of the cramped Mittelwerk tunnels, the death rate dropped dramatically. It was at its lowest in July 1944, when the SS recorded 105 deaths that month. But once Sonderstab Kammler was set up and subcamps began to appear around Nordhausen, more prisoners died than ever before. Combined with a very harsh winter, it's estimated that between October 1944 and March 1945, nearly 10,000 prisoners would die in the camps or work sites. In April 1945, the panicked evacuations of the camps began, and the British launched a bombing raid that destroyed the Bolke Kaserne camp. During this brief period, around 11,000 prisoners died. From A History of the Dora Camp, quote, "Based on the figures just presented, an overall death toll can be quickly estimated. For the whole concentration camp complex, which finally reached about 40,000 prisoners, the loss of human life during a period of slightly more than 20 months amounted to some 26,500 victims, 15,500 in the camp and the transports, and 11,000 at the time of the evacuations."
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is where I am going to end this part. In part 6, we're going to talk about the months at Mittelbau after liberation, the Dora trials, and we're going to be talking to a genocide historian about where Mittelwerk fit into the larger scheme of a Nazi war economy that was always run on slavery. Another thing we talked about in some earlier parts, it's often presented as like, you know, the Reich is burning and so they turned to concentration camp labor to like free up more men from the front. But work camps were a widespread thing in 1939. The entire German war economy was always run as a slave industry right from the beginning, prior to the start of the war.
It's just a matter of how quickly would it consume itself.
Yeah. Like, by design, it needed to expand to new territory and new population in order to find new populations to feed into its factories. But yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. So, I know this is not anything approaching a good end to this episode. But that is where we are going to be leaving it. If you made it through, listener, thank you for listening. This is not something that any of us are happy to be talking about, but again, this is a formative part of space exploration. This is something that without this, rockets, the moon landings wouldn't have happened. It is absolutely, like, you can draw lines between what happens under Mittelwerk to almost every space program in the world, whether through technology, like the Chinese space program's first flies of V2, copied Soviet copy of the V2. This is far-reaching, and there's no way to talk about space exploration without reckoning with this. But yeah, thank you for listening, and fuck, I don't know. Try and have a good day.
Try and salvage a day that you can.
Yeah.
Punch Nazis.
That too. Absolutely that too. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Crowbars are for sale at your local Home Depot or Princess Auto.
Yeah. Hijack a German bomber with a crowbar, brackets, and then get punished for 12 years for it.
Thank you to everyone who have signed up to support the show. And a big shout out to all of our top tier patrons. Our cyborg cats are Boss, Katiger Reptile, Charlie, Comrade Sleepy Bro, Daniel F., Graham E., Jesselyn T., Jorg 2, the Bart Cybril suspected Alzheimer's check-in, Kamo, Lane of the Wired, Matt, Mobius Striptease, Murray Motorsports, Mysterious Stranger, Number Negative, Oil Drum, Pat, Paul C., Rare Scrungles Fingus 3rd Edition, Skylab Bricks, Source Force, Spectre Cohen, Tortilla Baron, Vivek D., and Wingsmith. Our space dogs are A Union Thug, A. Blinkan, Akiogo, Guy is Best Guy, Ariel Badger Release, Agent Carter, Alice N., Andrew F., Andrew K., Angie, Angry Old Man, Yada Yada, Anthony C., Atomic Hobbit, Otto Fox, Baron M., Batfay, Ben L., Binary Badger, Beamy, Boomzilla, Brian F., Brian L., C., Cantaloupe Was Taken, Carson D., Chainsaw Snuggling, Chris K., Christian K., Cole C., Captain Lag, CSD 2016, Daddy Bongo, Daniel, Diz Smiley, Dom K., Dr. Shockmaster, Enk, Aaron, Eric J., Fractal Moonlight, Furious Luddite, George B., Grant K., Griffin, former snow shoveler of Burger King, Heiko S., Has Devin seen the amazing Chinese film To Live? Howl's Moving Pictures by Rush, Ian R., Jan M., James A., James C., James H., James T., Jamie K., Jarl Breadmaker, Jerry M., Jedediah D., John C., John Boy D., Jonathan G., Jonathan W., Johntastic 20x6, Juan, Just Morse, Kate B., Kate D., Corbin the Dog, Cruzzy, Lorgath, Luke O., McLean C., Mar, Marto, Maritza, Matthew M., Mr. Dr. John, Mitchell L., Newman Instrumentality Project, Narrow Ebb, New Name, Nicholas S., Norman W., Northeast Driver, NSFW NSA, Outlook Cub, Panda, Peep, Poopbutt, Randall, RBK, Rato B., Riley, Sailor of Fortune, Scott K., Sean F., Sean H., Central Kazoo, Sean P., Silly Vixen, Sparks, Spirit of Thunder, Swanee, The Best Sean, Thomas M., Tim P., Toasty Pen, Trash Dude, Virash T., Vrisk, Will W., William O., Zachary J.B., Zap, Zemo, Zim, and Zombie Dwarf. Albert Count, 182. Thank you for listening to another episode of Failure to Launch. If you want to follow us, we are Failure to Launch on Blue Sky and FT Launch Pod on Instagram. We also post our episodes with visual aids at Failure to Launch Podcast on YouTube. FTL intro and outro themes were provided by DJ Danarchy.